Hey guys, how we doing? This is the first in a series of videos that I've been wanting to do for a little while. So I know there are some of you out there who maybe you are following along with our online content, maybe you're not. Maybe you have some equipment at home outside of what we've been using in the online content, or maybe you're just looking for some workouts a little bit different than what we've been putting out. So instead of focusing on particular pieces of equipment, or particular movements, or just putting out more and different workouts, what I wanted to do is give you guys some very basic tools to create workouts for yourself, okay? So what we're gonna talk about today is fundamental movement patterns, right? And when we talk about fundamental movement patterns, we're talking about very basic movements that you can do either on their own or that you can combine into more complex movements, okay? So we've grouped these into three basic categories, okay? We have lower body movements, which is basically leg movements, lower extremities, upper body movements, that's gonna be arm movements, upper extremities, and then we have core movements, that's gonna be midsection, abs, things like that. So lower body movements, we're gonna group those into two basic movement types. We're gonna have bilateral extension and an isolateral step or lunge, okay? So bilateral extension, that is any movement where you have the feet even and you are driving the movement with both legs equally. So those are squats, deadlifts, cleans, snatches, hip extensions would fall into that category if it's a bilateral hip extension, on a GHD or something like that, glute bridges, any sort of movement where you're using both feet equally with the feet even, okay? Or both legs equally with the feet even. So, and I know it's going to hurt a lot of people's feelings to think that the squat and the deadlift are, the same movement pattern, but essentially they are. Squats, cleans, deadlifts, the only real difference between those movements is the range of motion in the knees and the degree of external rotation in the hip. Okay, aside from those variations, they are essentially the same movement pattern in the lower extremity. Right. The other grouping of our movement patterns is going to be the isolateral step lunge. So the isolateral step or lunge is any movement where you have the feet offset and you are using one leg to primarily drive the movement. You can have a little support from the other depending on the movement, but you are primarily focusing on one leg driving the movement here. So this is, as you would assume from the name of the category, lunges would be in this category, step-ups would be in this category, something like a Bulgarian split squat, rear foot elevated split squat would fit into this, a single leg RDL would fit into this category. So any single leg movement is going to be in our isolateral step lunge movement predominantly. And we can make some arguments about where certain movements would fit into either of these categories as we get to some of the more exotic movements. But this is just a very basic concept, okay? Moving on to the upper body, all right? We have pushing and pulling, all right? So those are pretty simple to conceptualize and categorize. So pushing movements are gonna be anything like a bench press or a push-up or an overhead press or a push press, anything where you are pushing an object away from your body or pushing your body away from an object, okay? And then pulling is the reverse. Rows, chin-ups, pull-ups, anything where you are pulling a body or pulling an object towards your body or pulling your body towards an object, okay? Very simple categorization there. The core, we have flexion and rotation, okay? So when we're talking about core flexion, right, this is actually two different types of flexion. We have trunk flexion, which would be like your classic crunches, and then we have hip flexion, which would be like a hanging leg raise or a GHD sit-up or something along those lines. And then rotation. So rotation is any movement where you are breaking the parallel position of the shoulders and the hips. So this could be a side throw. This could be a Russian twist or a landmine twist. Then we also have, partnered with those, anti-flexion and anti-rotation, okay? So anti-flexion would be any movement where you are, or really it's an isometric hold, where you're trying to resist flexion. So the easiest example of that would be a plank, okay? So in a plank, we're trying to keep the rigid, straight midline and resist flexion of the core, okay? An anti-rotation will be similarly any movement where you're resisting rotation, any movement where you're resisting the break of the parallel position of the shoulders and the hips. So a great example of that would be like a Pallof press, something along those lines, okay? Now, when we're building workouts, an easy concept for building a workout using these movements, if you want a nice full body workout 3 to 5 days a week, all you need to do is pick one movement that satisfies each of these categories, okay? So that could be one movement for each category, or you could pick some more complex movements that cover 2 or more categories, and we'll talk about that in a second. So for bilateral extension and isolateral extension, we want one movement for each of these categories. So maybe we're pairing a squat with a step up, or maybe we're pairing a clean with a lunge or something along those lines. And we also want one of these movements to be heavier and one of these movements to be lighter on most days, okay? That's not an absolute rule, but you don't want both of these movements to be real heavy. What I would do is maybe do, a heavy squat with a lighter step up, or maybe you're doing a heavy clean with some sort of lunge variation. But don't always make the bilateral extension movement the heavier movement, okay? You can do, maybe a heavy step up, heavy back rack step up with a barbell, and then maybe some kettlebell swings or something like that with a lighter weight and higher reps for your bilateral extension, okay? So one of these heavy, one of these lighter. It's also good to make one of these dynamic, at least a couple of days a week. So a dynamic movement here for the bilateral extension, that would be a clean, or a kettlebell swing, as we mentioned, maybe a box jump, something along those lines. Dynamic movement for the isolateral step or lunge could be jumping lunges, would be a simple one. A single leg drive, which is just like a single leg jumping movement. So dynamic isolateral is a little bit more exotic, but good to mix in as well. All right. For the upper body, pushing and pulling, the big thing you want to do with these is keep a good balance between your horizontal and vertical pushing and pulling. So on the pushing, a good balance between horizontal and vertical pushing. So one day you do a bench press, the next day you do an overhead press, or you do push-ups versus handstand push-ups, and try to keep that fairly even. Same thing with your pulling. You want to do horizontal rows just as much as you do chin-ups and pull-ups, okay? For the core, one movement for your flexion, one movement for your rotation, and then again, try to keep a good balance between active flexion and rotation and the anti-flexion and rotation, okay? Now, as I mentioned earlier, you can also choose movements that satisfy both or multiple movement patterns. So a good example of that would be, think about a thruster, all right? Thruster is a front squat into a push press, so that would satisfy our bilateral extension and would be a vertical push for the upper body as well. If you wanted to get even more complex in here, you could say something like a split jerk. A split jerk could be your dynamic isolateral step or lunge and your vertical overhead movement, all right? Something along the lines of a Turkish get-up. Turkish get-up would satisfy your isolateral step lunge, and it's an anti-rotation movement as well. So you can get creative with that. Again, a movement to satisfy each category. And like I said, one movement could satisfy 2 or more categories if you get a little creative there, all right? So basic fundamental movement patterns that you can use to create a wide variety of workouts for yourself, okay? So next video, we're gonna be talking about some fundamental tasks, okay? So a little bit different, but some fun stuff that you can mix into your workouts. So I'll see you then.